For Nelson.
Mr President, this bill is primarily about acknowledging and giving effect to our shared agreement that begging should not be criminalised. It is a straightforward matter that it shouldn't be criminal for one person to ask another person for money in a time of need. The criminalisation of poverty and homelessness, which is the context in which begging remains an offence, is now widely recognised as representative of an outdated understanding of social issues and an outdated understanding of what constitutes an appropriate government and community response to these issues. Begging is a symbol of social exclusion that merits attention. The causes of people begging are complex and include systemic societal issues that are beyond the control of an individual. Many who find themselves in situations where they need to beg never planned nor expected to be there and would prefer not to be in that situation. And while people who beg are often reviled and seen as deviating from what is deemed acceptable in public spaces, they are frequently victims themselves of past trauma, of crime, of economic deprivation and of social exclusion more broadly. Mr President, research in Victoria by Justice Connect in 2016 showed that among people who begged, 77% were experiencing homelessness, 87% had a mental illness, 77% were experiencing drug or alcohol dependence, 80% had been unemployed for 12 months or more, and 33% had experienced family violence, and 37% reported childhood trauma or abuse. Mr President, the law as it stands today, with begging as an offence, targets and criminalises some of the most deprived and most disadvantaged members of our society for the crime of being visibly poor and homeless. Our current approach does not address the root causes of homelessness or destitution, nor its consequences. Tasmanians who are in a position of desperation should receive support. That support should include housing, welfare, medical and mental health services, alcohol and drug services and social support. On these measures of support, in this state, we are falling well short. Fining people in such circumstances, criminalising them, is perverse, and saddling them with a potential criminal record does nothing to address the underlying causes that may have led them to begging. At present, people who beg find themselves in this situation due to factors largely beyond their control. If the act of begging criminalises them, we can broadly understand that they have ultimately been criminalised due to our community's policy failures. Tasmania's increased cost of living, for example, low incomes, inadequate supply of affordable housing, high unemployment rates and inadequate provision of mental health support services and drug and alcohol services. The criminal justice system, Mr President, is not the place to help people who are destitute. Organisations that work with people experiencing poverty and homelessness around Australia, researchers, legal practitioners and academics all agree that criminalising the actions of begging in these circumstances does nothing to address the underlying causes. What it does do, however, is perpetuate the stigmatisation of poverty, homelessness and disadvantage. It sends a message, Mr President. That message is that people who experience destitution, people who are homeless, people who beg, are at fault personally. They are bad. They are to be feared, is the message. This message reinforces negative community attitudes towards people who are homeless and those who beg. However, all evidence demonstrates that in the vast majority of cases, this message and these attitudes do not reflect the reality. Evidence tells us that substantially the activity of begging is one that is carried out in a way that is relatively passive and not accompanied by problematic or aggressive behaviours. That being said, my observation would be that it's common for people to feel uncomfortable about the presence of begging, even when it is a simple, passive, non-invasive action. I'd similarly observe that it's common for people to feel uncomfortable about even the presence in public spaces of people experiencing primary homelessness, that is, people who are rough sleepers. I note this discomfort, Mr President, amongst some members of the community. I think many people would prefer not to have to see or encounter people experiencing homelessness and destitution in public streets and spaces. My observation is that there are people who feel a sense of apprehension or even fear in sharing public spaces and streets with people who are visibly experiencing homelessness or destitution. And I'd suggest that that apprehension or fear is connected in some cases to the anticipation that those people who are homeless or destitute may behave in an aggressive or intrusive or unpleasant way. And other times, that apprehension or fear arises from actually seeing a person who is homeless or destitute in fact behaving in a public area in a way that is aggressive, intrusive or unpleasant, even if this is the minority of cases. So I acknowledge that those feelings are there in the community, and I believe it is our job to encourage those feelings to be resolved and better informed rather than encouraged. Mr President, research and evidence tells us largely that people who are homeless or destitute and in the public domain do not behave in ways that are aggressive, intrusive or unpleasant. Many would note that in those less common instances, the small proportion of times we actually see problematic behaviour in a public area by a person who's homeless or destitute, there's a high likelihood that that person in question may be being affected by mental ill health and or may be experiencing an issue with drugs or alcohol. And we would recognise, Mr President, that the response required is to ensure that person is not going to hurt themselves or others and to provide that person with support and services. I'll come back to these observations shortly in relation to the second part of this bill. Mr President, on the face of it, therefore, it's pleasing to see reform progressed in this area for our state. It certainly has been called for over many years, primarily by those in the social services area, including me in various previous roles in that sector. I fully support the repeal of subsections 1 and 1AA of Section 8 of the Police Offences Act 1935, which set out the offence of begging and the associated penalty. However, there are also aspects of this bill that I do not support, and I will spend some time discussing those aspects. It's a complex issue, and I hope we can discuss these issues in the debate today with careful thought and analysis, and I think we're off to a good start with the contribution from the member for Rumney. And like the member for Rumney, I had noted here that we need to be thoughtful about the use of language in regards to this activity. We have to ask ourselves about how we speak about our fellow citizens as whole people, not in terms of labelling them on the basis of one action that they may undertake. Mr President, the impact of the second part of this bill, the expansion or additional police dispersal powers in Section 15, will have on the members of the Tasmanian community who beg is significant. I believe it's entirely counter, in fact, to the stated intent of the first part of the bill. Further, it is poorly conceived, and as a result of that, it is unfair and discriminatory. The proposed amendment to Section 15B of the Police Offences Act 1935 would add to police powers in relation to dispersal of persons. Under these new powers, the police would be able to direct a person to leave a public place if they believed that by, in the course of, or in connection with begging, that person has intimidated or harassed a person, prevented or deterred persons from entering a business, or prevented or deterred the conduct of a business, or prevented or deterred persons from using a public facility that is in or in the vicinity of the place. Then it provides a descriptive list of what could be included as a public facility, but not an exhaustive list. Under Section 15B, a person failing to comply with such a direction to move on could receive a fine not exceeding 2 penalty units. This amendment, Mr President, creates new powers of dispersal that are specific to or connected with the activity of begging in a public place. It specifically places those who are begging at risk of attracting a fine, which we have already established is a perverse response to somebody who is destitute. I do not support the proposed amendments in Section 15B, and there's 3 key reasons for that. One is that those powers are not needed. The second reason is that they are not warranted. And the third reason is that they are discriminatory and stigmatising in exactly the same way that the offence of begging is in the first place, which renders the repeal in the first part of this bill meaningless and somewhat hypocritical. Mr President, I think we first need to ask ourselves, what is the intent of the inclusion of these new dispersal powers? What are these additional powers actually for? Who do police want to be able to move on under these new powers? And what specific behaviours do police want to be able to move people on for under these new powers? It's been expressed to us in briefings, Mr President, that the intent of this additional dispersal power is to provide police with the ability to respond to complaints made in relation to people begging. It has been expressed to us that there is a community expectation that police, when called with a complaint about a person begging, will have the ability to do something to remove that person in question. We've been told by the department that with the repeal of the offence of begging, there will no longer be a basis on which police can move on people who are begging. Hence, the government's claim that the inclusion of these additional move-on powers is required to maintain the same response that is currently available to police when called to deal with these complaints. And here I believe we need to test that claim and look more closely at what specific behaviours we're talking about warranting a move-on response. Mr President, we are told in the second reading speech that there were 61 complaints received by police about people who were begging. Over 3/4 of those complaints, more than 47 in fact, were made by business owners. We hear in the government's second reading speech that, and I quote, "The nature of the complaints varied. They generally reflected circumstances where beggars intimidated or harassed people or adversely impacted business." And that, and I quote, "In a minority of cases, yelling, spitting or other abuse was described by the caller." Let's look a little bit more closely at those statements about the complaints. I hear the following behaviours described: intimidation and harassment, yelling, spitting and other abuse. I also hear that some complainants report their business being adversely impacted by someone begging nearby. Something I would like to know from the government is how many of those 61 complaints were made in relation to the by far most common instance of begging, in which a person sits with a container in front of them to collect money and either with a written sign indicating their circumstances or perhaps by a straightforward verbal request ask people passing by for money. How many of those 61 complaints were relating to that form of begging? And then, how many of those 61 complaints were made in relation to begging that was accompanied by other problematic behaviour, such as intimidation or harassment, yelling, spitting or other abuse? I'm interested to know this, Mr President, because I would suggest that when it is the first instance, the most common form of simple, relatively passive begging, there should be no power for police to move people on for that behaviour. I would suggest that in cases where there is other problematic behaviour occurring in addition to begging, that behaviour may warrant being moved on. And I would suggest that no additional powers are required for that to occur. Further suggest that in instances where a person who is begging is also behaving in a way that, say, actively blocks the entrance to a business or actively deters people from patronising a business, that behaviour may warrant being moved on. And no additional powers are required for that to occur. Mr President, let's consider those problematic behaviours, sometimes associated with begging, that have been described in the second reading speech as being part of some complaints. Are the new powers being proposed needed to provide police with the power to move on people who are behaving in intimidating and harassing ways as part of their begging? Under the existing powers in section 15B, the police already have the power to direct a person to leave a public place if that person, A, has committed or is likely to commit an offence, or B, is obstructing or is likely to obstruct the movement of pedestrians or vehicles, or C, is endangering or likely to endanger the safety of another person, or D, has committed or is likely to commit a breach of the peace. Thinking first then about intimidating, harassing, aggressive or jostling behaviour that may be associated with begging, thinking about yelling, spitting or other abuse, I would suggest these can be dealt with under A in that list, which is has committed or is likely to commit an offence, where police can point to section 13 of the current Act, which contains the offence of creating a public annoyance. A public annoyance, Mr President, includes behaving in a violent, offensive or indecent manner, disturbing the public peace, engaging in disorderly conduct, insulting or annoying another person and committing any nuisance. Or it may be, when relevant, they could point to Section 12 of the current Act, which contains the offence of prohibited language and behaviour, which includes cursing, swearing, singing profane or obscene songs, language which is profane, indecent, obscene, offensive or blasphemous, and threatening, abusive or insulting words of behaviour to provoke a breach of the peace or may occasion a breach of the peace. In using Section 15B 1A as the basis for moving someone on, that's the one where has committed or is likely to commit an offence, the police do not have to bring an actual charge on that relevant offence. They just need to believe that the person has committed or is likely to commit the offence. There is the opportunity for discretion, and there is the opportunity to act in anticipation of an escalation of behaviour. It is not relevant to say, for example, that the offence of public annoyance is rarely, if ever, used, that people are rarely, if ever, actually charged with it. Here, they don't need to be charged with it. It just needs to be there on the statute book in order for the police to use it as the basis for moving people on under Section 15B 1A. Much the same, actually, Mr President, as the situation we have now with begging as an offence, where it's been explained to us by the police that it is rarely brought as a charge, but the police use it as the basis to move people on under Section 15B 1A. And further, beyond what can be captured under A, we also must remember that existing move-on powers can be used for behaviours captured by B, C and D. Obstructing or is likely to obstruct the movement of pedestrians and vehicles, that's B. C is endangering or likely to endanger the safety of another person. And D has committed or is likely to commit a breach of the peace. These are very broad. This provides very broad scope to move people on under the existing dispersal powers in Section 15B. We've heard from members of the legal profession that across the suite of offences in Section 13, Section 12, to provide a basis for using A, and the breadth of behaviours captured by B, C and D, across that there is plenty of scope for the police to use as a basis for moving people on those who are behaving in a problematic way while begging. And by that I mean those who are intimidating, harassing, being aggressive, jostling, blocking the footpath, creating a disturbance or causing a risk to others. We've heard from members of the legal profession experienced in these matters that no additional police powers are required to respond to such behaviour. However, Mr President, as a thought experiment, let's for a moment take the government's claim to be true. If it's true that Section 15B does not provide police with the power to move people on for behaviour in a public place that is, say, harassing or intimidating, then I would suggest that this indicates a gap which is relevant not just to the activity of begging, but potentially much more broadly. Because behaviour in a public place that is intimidating and harassing or aggressive and abusive, or which may present an active deterrent to people accessing a business, does not only happen in connection with the activity of begging. What is not clear then is why we would seek to remedy this general deficiency in police move-on powers by adding additional dispersible powers only connected to the activity of begging. Mr President, the proposed amendment would mean that people who are begging would be subject to legal constraints on their behaviour that are stricter than those faced by anyone else in the community. Under the proposed additional dispersal powers, a person could be undertaking an activity in a public place that wasn't begging but involved harassing or intimidating behaviour, and that situation would apparently not be captured by existing powers, and nor would the police be able to move them on under this new power proposed because there's no begging present. Let's think of some possible examples that could be considered here. If a person was standing on the street and soliciting donations for a charity and was so assertive and persistent in their approaches to passers-by that it amounted to intimidation and harassment, or was behaving in such a way to create a deterrent to people patronising a nearby business, they apparently, as we are told, would not be captured by these existing move-on powers and could not be moved on under this new power because they're not begging. Again, if a person was standing on the street and proselytising and was so assertive and persistent in their approaches that it amounted to intimidation and harassment, or were behaving in such a way to create a deterrent to people patronising a nearby business, they apparently could not be captured by the existing powers we're given to believe, and they could not be moved on under the new power because they're not begging. While the behaviours exhibited and the impact on passers-by in these two examples may be near identical to those problematic behaviours sometimes associated with begging, under the proposed expansion of dispersal powers here, only those people who are engaged in begging would be subject to move-on powers and consequently subject to a penalty if they failed to comply. Mr President, this new power is categorically discriminatory and unfair. If police genuinely cannot move someone on who is behaving in a way that is harassing or intimidating or actively deterring people from patronising a business, then there is a broader gap in the suite of offences currently on the books and in the existing move-on powers in section 15B. If that gap is to be filled, it should be filled to capture all instances in which those behaviours may be exhibited and not tied only and specifically to an associated action of begging. If what was proposed here was a broader effort to add move-on powers to deal with these problematic behaviours in whatever circumstances they occur, it would not be discriminatory and we could consider the evidence for it and possibly support it. But that isn't what's presented to us. Mr President, we are asked here to support additional powers that are either unnecessary or, if necessary, they are drafted with specific reference to begging and through that they are discriminatory. Mr President, it's been put to us in the briefings we've received that many of the people engaging in begging are observed to have issues relating to mental ill health or drug and alcohol use. And as a result of these circumstances, they sometimes behave in ways that are problematic or alarming to members of the public. I take that to refer to those kinds of behaviours mentioned already: intimidation or harassment, yelling at people, spitting or directing abuse to people and such the like. People with mental ill health or a drug and alcohol issue are experiencing health problems, Mr President. I think we would all agree that we most appropriately primarily respond to these issues with a health response. I'm aware that the police are constantly called on as first responders to incidences where a person with mental ill health or a drug and alcohol issue is causing problems for themselves or perhaps for others in a public place and requires a response. These calls sometimes relate to people who are homeless and sometimes to people who aren't homeless. The police are, in fact, often the ones who are required to resolve these problems or disturbances and connect the person in question with a health response to their issues. I know that this happens all the time and that police are very compassionate in using their discretion and acting to assist people in these circumstances. I believe it wouldn't be unusual for police to have to manage such a situation which involved a person experiencing mental ill health or drug and alcohol issues who's directing problematic behaviour at others or affecting others with their problematic behaviour. I'd suggest this happens quite commonly. And I'd suggest this happens commonly in instances that have nothing to do with begging and in which there's no correlated begging activity occurring at the time. Not always, but many times it wouldn't be related to begging. In those common instances, is the government perhaps saying that there's no response available to police to manage the situation if a complaint is made to them? Indeed, if a complaint is made about problematic behaviour such as intimidation, harassment or abuse that's being undertaken by a person with mental ill health or a drug and alcohol issue that's affecting or being directed at those around them in a public place, what response is currently available to police? Of course, in instances such as this that are relatively common, there are a range of responses available to and utilised effectively by police. They don't ignore these situations, they manage them. So my next question is, can the government explain, in a situation which involves a person who has mental ill health or a drug and alcohol issue causing problematic behaviour such as intimidation, harassment, abuse, who is also engaging in begging, why do police not have available to them those same responses as a situation that didn't have begging? If police regularly manage the former, then they can equally well manage the latter under the same powers and actions available to them now. They don't need additional begging-specific powers to manage situations involving behaviour connected to mental health or drug and alcohol issues. Mr. President, what we have established in relation to problematic behaviours sometimes associated with begging is this. There is already the power to move people on in respect to the most problematic behaviours. If a new power is needed, it should be able to capture the problematic behaviour with or without begging being associated with it. Police already manage difficult behaviour associated with mental ill health and alcohol and drug issues in circumstances not related to begging, so they are certainly able to do so when begging is also present. Mr. President, I would like now to return to the most common situation in which someone is begging, because what has become clear in the briefings we've received is that when we ask ourselves, what are these additional powers actually for? Who do police want to be able to move on under this additional power that they can't under existing powers once the offence of begging is repealed? The answer is that these additional powers are being sought to allow police to move on people who are simply begging, with no accompanying problematic behaviours. With the repeal of the offence of begging, this simple act of begging, with no accompanying problematic behaviours, is the only action that can no longer be captured by the existing move-on powers. As I stated earlier, I don't believe there should be a power for police to move on a person who is undertaking this simple action. Moving someone on in these circumstances is counter to the intent of this bill. Some of our fellow citizens experience homelessness and destitution. And while we may find it uncomfortable or unpleasant to see or encounter these fellow citizens, they have as much right to be in the public streets and public spaces as we do. All citizens have the right to be subject to the same legal constraints on their activity and behaviour. Citizens experiencing homelessness or destitution and engaging in a behaviour we've deemed to be legal should not be targeted with discriminatory constraints that apply only in association with that legal behaviour. I think the government here, Mr. President, have twisted themselves in some contradictory knots. It appears that they still want to be able to make people who beg go away. Out of sight, perhaps out of mind. But the things that will genuinely make begging go away are big and complex and structural. They are typically the responsibility of government policy, an adequate safety net, enough affordable housing, enough health and mental health services and drug and alcohol treatment and support, adequate family support services, an excellent education system and available jobs and participation opportunities. These are the imperatives to make real change in poverty, in homelessness, in destitution, and ultimately in reducing begging. When we stigmatise and penalise begging, when we move begging on because it offends our sensibilities, when we force begging to be out of sight and out of mind, we actually remove the imperative to demand and act for real change in delivering those real solutions. We absolve government and ourselves from taking responsibility for those big, complex and often wicked problems. The repeal of Section 8 and the removal of begging as an offence is a step in the right direction towards acknowledging that we must not scapegoat individuals who beg, but rather take that collective responsibility onto our shoulders. The inclusion of the begging-specific addition to dispersal powers in Section 15 is an immediate step backwards, right back to where we were. Mr. President, that is hypocritical. It is inconsistent and discriminatory lawmaking, and it is just plain wrong. I ask that members here, when we consider this bill, do not participate in legislating this hypocritical and unnecessary addition to police move-on powers, and to consider voting against the second part of this bill, and supporting the first part with absolute sincerity.
The question is that the bill be now read the second